framed and fired like I was nothing. But the second I walked out, their empire started collapsing. Stick with me while I share my story. And if it touches you, don't forget to support our channel by hitting that subscribe button, dropping a like, and sharing it with the people you care about. My name is Callum Reyes, and I never thought I would become the villain in a story I helped build. I didn't grow up with money. My father worked 2 jobs, and my mother cleaned offices at night. I learned early that if I wanted stability, I had to earn it. That mindset followed me into my career. When I joined Whitaker Beauty Group, it wasn't glamorous. I started as a junior analyst, quiet and focused, always staying late, always double-checking numbers. Over the years, I became known as the guy who could fix anything behind the scenes. When expansion plans looked too risky, I adjusted projections carefully. When costs quietly rose, I found ways to balance them without causing panic. I wasn't flashy, but I was dependable. That's why the morning everything fell apart felt unreal. I was called into the executive conference room. Sloane Whitaker sat at the head of the table. Perfect posture, calm expression. Beside her was Brant Hollowell, the CFO. There were printed documents in front of them. Brant began speaking first. He claimed there were irregularities in financial projections. He said numbers had been adjusted in a way that concealed risk exposure. He used words like manipulated and unauthorized. Then he said my name. I remember blinking, thinking there had to be some mistake. I asked to see the reports. The data looked like my work, but altered. Subtle changes. Small shifts that made it seem like I had hidden losses instead of balancing risk. I tried to explain. I spoke calmly. I said those weren't the final versions I submitted, but the room already felt decided. Sloane looked at me with disappointment, not anger. That hurt more. She said trust was everything in leadership. She said the company couldn't afford ethical uncertainty. And just like that, she terminated me. No investigation, no private conversation, no chance to defend myself properly. Security walked me to my desk while coworkers stared. Some looked confused. Some avoided eye contact. I packed my things in silence, my hands shaking, but my face still. The worst part wasn't losing the job. It was realizing someone had planned this. The evidence was too organized, too polished. It wasn't an accident, it was a setup. As I stepped outside the building, carrying a cardboard box, I felt something shift inside me. I wasn't just unemployed, I was betrayed. And deep down, I knew one thing with certainty. They had just removed the person who understood the company's real financial balance better than anyone else in that building. The first night after I was fired, I didn't sleep. I kept replaying the meeting in my head. The documents. The calm tone in Brant Hollowell's voice. The way Sloane Whitaker avoided looking at me for too long. It wasn't anger in her eyes. It was something else. Pressure. By morning, the shock had turned into clarity. I opened my personal laptop and started reviewing my saved files. I had always kept copies of my finalized reports at home. Not because I expected betrayal, but because I believed in protecting my work. As I compared my original projections to the printed versions they showed in the meeting, the differences were obvious. Tiny adjustments. Risk exposure percentages shifted just enough to look reckless. Forecast buffers removed. It was surgical. Someone with high-level access had altered them. And there weren't many people who could. Brant was one of them. Or let's say, more I thought about it, the more the pieces fit. Over the past 6 months, Brant had been pushing aggressive expansion into luxury retail markets. I had warned against it. The cash flow wasn't stable enough. Our debt ratio was climbing quietly. I recommended slower growth. He didn't like that. We had disagreed in private meetings. He called me overly cautious. I called his plans dangerous. Now I understood. If expansion failed, someone would need to take the blame. And if he removed the only person who truly understood the numbers, there would be no one left to challenge him. But here's what he didn't consider. I had built the internal forecasting system they were using. I knew its strengths. I also knew its weaknesses. I knew exactly which variables needed careful monitoring to prevent collapse, and I knew those variables were already strained. 2 weeks after I left, I heard from an old colleague, Merritt Colfax. He sounded nervous. Sales projections were suddenly being revised upward publicly. Investors were being promised strong growth. Meanwhile, operational costs were quietly increasing. "They're pushing hard," Merritt told me. "It feels rushed." I wasn't surprised. Without my conservative buffers, their reports would look optimistic. Too optimistic. But I didn't feel satisfaction yet. I felt something heavier. I had given years of loyalty to that company. I believed in what we were building. Watching it head toward danger felt like watching a house I helped design being set on fire. Then the first crack appeared. A supplier dispute went public. Payments were delayed. Production slowed. Retail partners began asking questions. And suddenly, the aggressive expansion didn't look so bold anymore. It looked fragile. For the first time since I walked out of that building, I allowed myself to feel something close to calm. I hadn't sabotaged anything. I hadn't needed to. They were doing it themselves. And deep down, I knew this was only the beginning. By the end of the month, the cracks were impossible to hide. Whitaker Beauty Group had announced 3 new luxury store openings in major cities. The press releases were confident. The projections were glowing. But behind the scenes, things were tightening fast. Merritt called me again one evening. His voice was lower this time. "They're moving money around," he said, "shifting funds from long-term reserves to cover short-term expansion costs." That was dangerous. Those reserves existed for stability. If revenue dipped even slightly, there would be nothing protecting them. I asked him one simple question. "Are they adjusting the risk models?" There was a pause. "No, they simplified them." That confirmed everything. The system I built wasn't perfect, but it was layered. It had warnings built into it. If debt ratios crossed certain thresholds, it would flag internal alerts. If inventory turnover slowed, it would recommend contraction. Removing those safeguards made the numbers look cleaner, but it also removed the early warning signs. Brandt wasn't just taking risks, he was blinding the dashboard. A week later, the second crack hit. One of the new locations underperformed badly in its opening month. The lease costs were far higher than projected, and foot traffic didn't match expectations. Instead of slowing down, leadership doubled down. They launched aggressive discount campaigns to create artificial demand. Discounting luxury products damages brand perception. I had warned about that years ago. Investors began asking harder questions. And then something happened I didn't expect. Sloane Whitaker requested a private call with Merritt. I only found out because Merritt told me afterward. She had asked about historical forecasting assumptions. She wanted to understand why the company's stability felt weaker than expected. That told me something important. She was starting to feel it. Pressure. Not from me. From reality. For a brief moment, I wondered if she suspected the truth about my firing. If she questioned whether the reports were really manipulated by me or by someone else. But wondering didn't change anything. I was still unemployed. My reputation had taken a hit. Recruiters hesitated when they heard I had been terminated over financial misconduct. Even though nothing had been proven publicly, suspicion lingers. That part hurt the most. I had given that company everything. Long nights, missed holidays, careful planning. And in return, I was labeled untrustworthy. Meanwhile, Brandt Hollowell was being praised in executive meetings for his bold leadership. Until the third crack appeared. A major retail partner pulled back from a distribution agreement due to financial uncertainty. That phrase spread quickly. Analysts began digging deeper into public filings. Stock prices started slipping, and the more they slipped, the more aggressive the internal decisions became. Panic makes people reckless. I wasn't celebrating. I was watching, because I knew something they didn't fully understand yet. The system I built had one final protective layer. One that couldn't simply be removed without consequences. And soon, it was going to activate on its own. The final protective layer I built into the system wasn't dramatic. It wasn't a secret button or some hidden trap. It was something much simpler. Transparency. Every financial adjustment made inside the forecasting system created a time-stamped internal log. It recorded who accessed the files, what was changed, and when. Most executives never paid attention to it because it sat quietly in the background. But it was always there. I didn't design it to protect myself. I designed it to protect the company. 2 months after I was fired, Whitaker Beauty Group scheduled its quarterly board review. Investors were uneasy. The stock had dropped nearly 18%. Expansion costs were climbing faster than projected revenue. Suppliers were demanding faster payments. Behind closed doors, pressure was building. That same week, Merritt called again. This time, his voice carried something different. Callum, internal audit is digging into the forecasting system. I felt my pulse steady instead of spike. Why now? I asked. Because the numbers don't match earlier archived reports. Someone noticed inconsistencies between versions. There it was, the archived reports. My original submissions were stored in the system's history. Even if printed copies had been altered, the digital log couldn't lie. It would show exactly when projections were modified and which executive account authorized the changes. I didn't need revenge. I needed patience. 3 days later, I received an unexpected email from a board member named Elridge Morrow. I had met him only twice before. He requested a private meeting. Not with Brant, not with Sloane, with me. We met in a quiet office downtown. He didn't waste time with small talk. Your termination was based on projected manipulation, he said. Can you explain your forecasting process from start to finish? I walked him through everything. The layered risk buffers, the conditional alerts, the reason conservative projections protected long-term stability. I explained that removing safeguards would temporarily inflate confidence while increasing structural risk. He listened carefully. Then he asked the question that mattered. Did you alter financial data to conceal exposure? I looked him directly in the eyes. No. He nodded slowly, almost like he already knew the answer. Before leaving, he said something that stayed with me. The system logs tell a very detailed story. That night, for the first time since being fired, I allowed myself to breathe deeply. The truth wasn't emotional. It wasn't loud. It was documented. Inside Whitaker Beauty Group, tension must have been unbearable. If the audit confirmed unauthorized executive-level changes, it wouldn't just be a technical mistake. It would be deliberate misrepresentation. And deliberate. Misrepresentation at that level doesn't end quietly. I didn't know what Sloane Whitaker was feeling. Betrayal? Fear? Regret? But I knew one thing for certain. The narrative that painted me as reckless was about to flip. And when it did, the collapse wouldn't just be financial, it would be personal. The board meeting happened on a Friday morning. I wasn't inside the room, but I didn't need to be. Merritt kept his phone close, sending short updates whenever he could step out. The internal audit had finished its review of the forecasting system. Every adjustment made after my final submissions had been traced. The timestamps showed that the projections were modified late at night from an executive account. Brant Hollowell's account. Not once, multiple times. Risk buffers had been manually reduced. Exposure percentages had been edited. Alerts had been disabled. All after I submitted clean versions of the reports. By noon, Merritt sent one message. It's exploding. Apparently, Brant tried to argue that the changes were strategic refinements. He claimed leadership had the right to adjust models. But the issue wasn't adjustment, it was the reason behind it. The edits made the company appear more stable to investors while hiding increasing risk. That crossed a line. By the end of the day, Brant was placed on administrative leave pending further investigation. But the real shock wasn't his suspension, it was Sloane. According to Merritt, she looked blindsided. She had trusted Brant's confidence. She believed the optimistic projections were aggressive, but manageable. She didn't realize the safety layers had been stripped away without board approval, which meant one thing. She had fired me based on information she never verified herself. Late that evening, my phone rang from a number I hadn't seen in weeks. Sloane Whitaker. For a moment, I considered letting it go to voicemail, but I answered. Her voice sounded different. Not polished, not controlled, just tired. "I owe you a conversation," she said. There was no defensiveness in her tone, no executive authority, just weight. She explained that the audit findings were clear. The original projections I submitted were conservative and responsible. The altered versions presented during my termination meeting had been changed afterward. She paused before saying the next words. "I'm sorry." It should have felt satisfying, but it didn't. Because an apology doesn't repair public damage. It doesn't erase weeks of suspicion or restore professional reputation overnight. She then said something I expected, but still felt heavy hearing. "The board wants you back." Not as an analyst, as interim chief financial officer. The irony almost made me laugh. The man they escorted out with a box was now being asked to stabilize the company before investors lost complete confidence. But before I answered, I asked her one question. Why should I trust that this won't happen again? There was silence on the other end, because now, for the first time, she understood exactly what it felt like to have trust broken. The silence on the phone stretched longer than I expected. When Sloane finally spoke, her voice was softer than I had ever heard it. "You shouldn't," she said. "Not without protection." That answer surprised me. She explained that the board was restructuring oversight immediately. Executive-level financial changes would now require multi-member approval. Audit logs would be reviewed monthly by an independent committee. No single person would control projections again. It sounded responsible. It sounded overdue. But policies weren't my real concern. Reputation was. I was fired publicly, I told her. No clarification. No defense. If I come back quietly, it looks like nothing happened. She didn't argue. "You're right," she said. "If you return, it will be public. The board will release a statement correcting the record." That mattered. Not for pride, for credibility. We scheduled an in-person meeting for Monday. Walking back into that same building felt strange. 2 months earlier, I had left carrying a cardboard box under watchful eyes. This time, the receptionist stood when I entered. The energy was completely different, tense, uncertain. The board members were already seated when I stepped into the conference room. Elridge Morrow gave me a steady nod. Sloane looked composed, but not untouchable anymore. There was humility in her posture. They outlined the situation clearly. Stock. Volatility was increasing. 2 expansion projects were paused. Vendors wanted reassurance. Investors needed confidence restored fast. They needed stability. They needed truth. And they needed someone who understood both the numbers and the damage. Elridge spoke directly. "We mishandled your termination. The board relied on altered data. That failure is ours." Hearing that publicly, even in a closed room, shifted something inside me. Then Sloane said it plainly. "Callum, I made a decision without verifying the foundation. That cost you. I'm asking for a chance to correct it." I looked around, the room. 2 months ago, I felt powerless here. Now, they were asking for my leadership. But this wasn't about revenge anymore. If I accepted, I wouldn't be returning to watch them fail. I would be responsible for saving what was left, and saving something broken requires more strength than walking away. So I set my conditions. Full authority over financial restructuring, public reinstatement with a formal statement clearing my name, and complete transparency moving forward, no exceptions. They agreed. As I left the building that day, there was no cardboard box in my hands, just a decision. I wasn't coming back for revenge. I was coming back to rebuild. My return was announced 3 days later. The official statement was clear. It said the internal audit confirmed that financial projections had been altered without my authorization. It stated that my termination was based on incomplete and inaccurate information. It confirmed my reinstatement as interim chief financial officer. For the first time in weeks, my name wasn't attached to suspicion. Inside the company, the atmosphere was uneasy. Some employees avoided eye contact, maybe out of guilt for believing the worst. Others quietly welcomed me back. Merritt gave me a firm handshake and said, "Feels like balance is being restored." But restoring balance wasn't simple. The numbers were worse than the public knew. Expansion costs had drained reserve capital. Discount campaigns had weakened profit margins. Vendor relationships were strained. The company wasn't collapsing yet, but it was standing on unstable ground. My first move was immediate and unpopular. I froze all new expansion projects. No new store openings. No aggressive marketing pushes. No cosmetic financial smoothing. Stability first, growth later. Some department heads resisted. They argued that slowing down would signal weakness. "It's not weakness," I told them. "It's discipline." Next, I reinstated every safeguard that had been removed from the forecasting system. Risk alerts were reactivated. Debt ratio. Triggers were restored. Cash flow buffers were increased. Then came the hardest decision. We had to close one of the underperforming new locations. It was expensive. It would attract attention. But keeping it open just to save face would bleed the company slowly. I refused to make decisions for appearances. When the closure was announced, internally, reactions were mixed. Some saw it as retreat. Others understood it was survival. Sloane supported every decision publicly. That mattered more than she probably realized. She didn't try to soften the messaging or override my calls. She stood beside them. Late one evening, after most employees had left, she stopped by my office. "I didn't realize how fast things were unraveling," she admitted. "Momentum can hide cracks," I replied. She nodded. I trusted confidence over caution. There was no defensiveness in her voice anymore, just reflection. The following weeks were intense. Long hours, hard conversations, negotiations with vendors, rebuilding investor trust through transparency instead of polished optimism. Slowly, something shifted. Stock volatility steadied. Supplier terms stabilized. Cash reserves stopped shrinking. It wasn't dramatic. There was no sudden surge, but collapse had stopped. And in business, sometimes stopping the fall is the real victory. I had been framed, fired, and humiliated. Now I was steering the company back from the edge. Not with anger, with control. The deeper I went into the company's finances, the clearer the damage became. Brandt's edits weren't random. They had been timed carefully. Right before investor briefings, right before expansion approvals, right before major spending decisions. The inflated projections had created artificial confidence, which pushed the company into commitments it wasn't ready for. It wasn't just reckless, it was calculated. The board's investigation moved quietly but thoroughly. Legal teams reviewed documentation. Outside auditors examined communications and approvals. I stayed focused on rebuilding operations, but I could feel the weight of what was unfolding behind closed doors. One afternoon, Elridge asked me to join a brief session. Brandt had officially resigned. The language in the announcement was polite, citing leadership misalignment, but everyone in that room understood what it meant. His access had been used to alter financial safeguards in a way that misrepresented risk exposure. There would be consequences beyond resignation. Sloane sat across the table, silent as the board finalized next steps. The situation had cost the company millions in value and months of stability. But it had also cost her something less measurable: authority, trust. After the meeting, she asked me to walk with her. We ended up in the empty hallway outside the executive offices. "I built this company from one product line," she said quietly. I thought surrounding myself with strong personalities meant strength. I didn't realize I stopped questioning them. I understood what she meant. Leadership can become isolation. Confidence can turn into blind spots. I should have verified the data myself, she continued. I should have asked you directly before making that decision. That was the heart of it, not just altered spreadsheets, a broken chain of trust. I won't make that mistake again, she said. For the first time, I believed her. Over the next month, we focused on rebuilding more than finances. We rebuilt structure. Oversight committees met regularly. Financial summaries were simplified and shared across departments to encourage transparency. No more information bottlenecks. No more single points of control. Employees began noticing the shift. Meetings were more open. Questions were encouraged instead of dismissed. Assumptions were tested instead of accepted. The company wasn't just stabilizing, it was maturing. One evening, I stood in my office looking at the skyline, thinking about the day I was escorted, out with a box in my hands. I remembered the humiliation, the anger, the silence. Now I felt something different. Not victory, clarity. I hadn't destroyed anyone to get here. The truth had simply done its job, and sometimes that's the strongest form of revenge. The final quarter closed with numbers no one had expected 3 months earlier. Not explosive growth, not headlines, just steady recovery. Revenue stabilized. Operating costs were under control. Investor confidence returned, not because of bold promises, but because the projections were honest. Vendors extended longer terms, again. Employees stopped whispering in hallways. The company was no longer surviving, it was rebuilding. During the quarterly board meeting, Elridge reviewed the performance report and then looked at me. This turnaround would not have happened without disciplined financial leadership, he said. Callum restored operational integrity. There was no applause, just quiet agreement. Sloane spoke next. I made a decision earlier this year that harmed both the leader and this company, she said plainly. Today's stability exists because that mistake was corrected. Hearing that, in a room where I had once been dismissed without defense, felt heavier than any public praise. After the meeting, Sloane asked me to stay. She didn't stand behind her desk this time. She sat across from me at the small conference table. The board wants to make your position permanent, she said. Full authority as CFO. Months ago, that title had been taken from me in minutes. Now it was being offered back with weight and respect. But I didn't answer immediately, because this wasn't about reclaiming a title anymore. I'll accept, I said finally, if we agree on one thing. She waited. No more decisions built on urgency without verification. If something looks wrong, we pause, even if it costs time. She nodded without hesitation. Agreed. The official announcement came the next morning. Permanent reinstatement, structural reforms, financial recovery plan on track. There were no dramatic speeches, no celebration banners, just steady work. A week later, I passed the same security desk where I had once surrendered my badge. The guard smiled and said, "Glad you're back for good." So was I. But not because I proved someone wrong, because I proved something right. Integrity outlasts accusation. Patience outlasts humiliation. And truth, even when delayed, has a way of standing back up. I was framed. I was fired. I walked away with nothing but my name. And in the end, that name was the only thing strong enough to bring me best.